This is the full story of how I quit my job to travel around the United States for 1 year in a teardrop trailer. This is the story of the path I took and the places I visited while driving in a big circle around the country. This is the story of me venturing from Florida to California to Washington to the Canadian Rockies to Maine and back to Florida. This is how I drove through 39 states, through 3 countries, and over 34,000 miles. This is all the amazing places I visited, and some of the problems I had along the way. So this is the current state of my trailer. It's sitting on 4 jacks, and my wheel completely came off. Trying to start it, but it's not doing anything. So I think my battery's dead. From start to finish, this is the story of my full journey. This is the story of how I escaped normal life. And just exactly 1 week from now, I will be on the road and I will be living in a trailer. In October of 2021, I took one final look at all the things I owned and all the things I would associate with home up to that point in my life. And just a few days later, I packed it all up and I moved it all into storage. This is my life, 5 feet by 10 feet.
Some folks measure their success by the label.
I kept a few of the essentials like pots and pans and some clothes for the road, and I put all the essentials I needed for the next year in my teardrop trailer.
Like a noose, but not me.
And as I was leaving Tampa, I took one final picture of the city I called home for the last 10 years.
Not me.
My first stop was to drive a few hours north from Tampa to Jacksonville so I could spend the last few days in Florida with family and friends.
Give me wings in a guitar case. Show me to the stage.
And after about a week in Jacksonville, it was time for me to hit the actual open road. It was time for me to drive up to Tennessee so I could see some friends up there. I went to Rockville, Murfreesboro, Nashville, and Memphis before heading west into Arkansas to catch up with 2 more friends I haven't seen in a really long time. For the first few weeks on the road, I was lucky enough to have friends let me stay at extra bedrooms and couches wherever I could. It wasn't until I got to Arkansas that I actually started sleeping in the teardrop. I spent about a week in the Hot Springs, Arkansas area where I just camped out and really enjoyed my first week on the road. On Thanksgiving Day, I took the venture from Arkansas into Texas. I stopped in Texarkana and eventually making my way over to Dallas. After being in Texas for a few days, a friend from Tampa flew in so that we could spend a few days with mutual friends in the area. In Texas, I started getting a taste of what I was really going to experience out on the open road. Firing a shotgun for the first time, seeing a longhorn, seeing woolly mammoth bones, and where JFK was shot. These are just a few of the examples of the diversity I was going to see out on the open road. My friend flew back to Florida and I headed south into the heartland of Texas. I went to Austin, San Antonio, and Corpus Christi. After a few days in the Corpus Christi area, I hugged the shoreline and drove up to Big Bend National Park. Once I got to Big Bend, I felt like I had arrived out west. Amazing rock formations, gorgeous hikes, and beautiful skies. It was here that I started to fall in love with the open road lifestyle. I knew that I had made the right choice at this time in my life to see the country. I ended up being in Big Bend National Park during Christmas. On Christmas Eve night, under a clear, dark sky, I sat in a natural hot spring right on the Rio Grande River and talked to other travelers from all over the country. We shared stories from the road and got to know each other a little bit better, while we all just looked up and stared at the Milky Way above us. On the south end of Big Bend National Park, on the other side of the Rio Grande, is a small Mexican town, Boqueles. I crossed the border for the afternoon and wandered around the town. About an hour and a half northwest of Big Bend National Park lies the small town of Marfa, a tiny artsy town known for two things, the Prada Marfa store and the Marfa Mystery Lights. On the outside, Prada Marfa appears to be just what it is, a Prada store in the middle of nowhere, but when you get up a little closer, you see the real bohemian side of Marfa. The Mystery Lights bring in visitors from all around the area. Far off in the distance, every night, dancing ball of lights mystify those who show up to see them, as they float above the vast emptiness of the desert. So weird how that just moves around like that. The next morning, I got up and drove into the land of enchantment, New Mexico. I spent about a week on some BLM land just 1 mile south of Carlsbad Caverns. Since I was there a week, I got to get a little bit closer to other full-time travelers, getting to hear their stories from where they've been and how long they've been on the road. I was starting to make my first full-time traveler friends. I did a tour of the caverns before heading up to Roswell. Roswell was exactly what you'd expect, touristy and kitschy, if you like that sort of thing. I wanted to see more of New Mexico, but by now it was January and the temperatures were starting to dip a little bit below my liking. It is not warm out here. Temperature is reading 27 degrees, but it says it feels like 16. So I set my eyes on Arizona and headed west, but not before taking up a recommendation and stopping by the town of Ruidoso, New Mexico. Ruidoso ended up being one of my favorite places I've ever visited. I knew absolutely nothing about the town before I got there, but it was quintessential America. A small town in the middle of nowhere. Taking up the last-minute recommendation to see this small town was exactly what I came out here to do. To see parts of the nation I've never even heard about before. One of the travelers I met while staying in Carlsbad Caverns called me up one day and said she was at White Sands National Park, just outside of Alamogordo. So I drove over from Ruidoso and we did a hike through the park together. After 2 days at White Sands National Park, I wanted to go into warmer climates, so I headed into Las Cruces, New Mexico. Las Cruces ended up being one of my favorite campsites to this point. Rugged mountain hikes all around me, gorgeous sunsets, and just outstanding views. I stayed at Las Cruces for a week and then drove into the Chiricahua National Monument, an area that was recommended to me while I was in Big Bend National Park. The next morning I woke up at 6 a.m. and to temperatures in the low 30s, so I could do a sunrise hike in the Chiricahua National Monument up Sugarloaf Mountain. I was all by myself and it was absolutely stunning, one of my favorite hikes ever. From there I journeyed into Bisbee, Tombstone, Tucson, Phoenix, Mesa, Saguaro National Park, and eventually landing in Quartzsite, Arizona. While camping in an area known as Indian Bread Rocks, I met a fellow traveler who had 2 dogs and had been on the road for over a year. She told me about a nomad event going on in Quartzsite known as Schoolie Palooza. Every year, thousands of nomads venture out to the middle of the desert in January and essentially put on a free festival. Bands, fire twirlers, DJs, and vendors. I met people from all over the country who had been living this lifestyle for years. I started to connect on a more personal level with some of the other nomads I was meeting. The simplicity and the minimalism of this lifestyle really started to take hold for me, and I started to appreciate really what I had. I started to identify as a full-time traveler. But on February 17th, 2021, I learned some of the heartache about what it's like to have a home on wheels. While trying to find a place to sleep for the night in the Joshua Tree area, I hit a pothole and ended up cracking the axle on my Teardrop. My little home was broken and I didn't know what to do. Fortunately, just a few weeks earlier at the Schoolie Palooza event, I met someone who lives in the Joshua Tree area and he knew a thing or two about cars. I had it towed to Ray's place and he fixed my axle within a week. I really believe that everything happens for a reason, and me meeting a mechanic at the Schoolie Palooza event just cemented the fact that I was at the right place at the right time. If it hadn't been for Ray and his mechanic skills, I really just don't know what I would have done. Do I continue traveling and just do everything in my car? Do I turn around and head back to Florida? I just really didn't know what I was going to do. But fortunately he got me up and running and I made a friend for life. Thank you so much, Ray, for helping me out. I couldn't be more appreciative. After my little setback, I pushed through to the California coast and saw Slab City, my first snowfall of the journey, hiked through some slot canyons, found some interesting desert art, and explored San Diego, La Jolla, Encinitas, and eventually Newport Beach. While in Newport Beach, I met a woman I had started talking to online. Her name was Waleska and we chatted through the evening. And even though I left Newport the next day, we continued to chat every night while I was back on the road. By now I had turned around so I could go back to Lake Havasu, the Hoover Dam, Valley of Fire, Lake Mead, and Las Vegas. I did a fun day hike to some natural hot springs and part of the Colorado River, and slept just outside the city in a dried up lake bed. While in Las Vegas, Waleska and her friend flew out so we could all spend a few days in Sin City together. After Waleska left Vegas, I drove just outside of the city to Red Rock Canyon. It was just so weird being back in nature after spending a few days in a big city like Vegas. Hotel rooms, daily showers, surrounded by people, cars, and noise. It took me about 3 days to get accustomed to sleeping in the Teardrop again. I was happy to see Waleska, but excited to get back on my journey as well. My next stop was Death Valley. Death Valley ended up being a better park than I expected. Spectacular views stretched out before me on every drive, and there was something humbling about being in the lowest place below sea level in the US, and in the presence of what was once recorded the hottest place on Earth. From Death Valley, I stayed on the eastern side of the Sierras, and I headed north into the small town of Mammoth Lakes, California. It was the first time I ever saw skiing and snowboarding in person outside of TV. Coming from Florida, I was just mesmerized and sat there and watched everybody come down that hill for at least an hour. Next up was a place I've wanted to visit for a long time, Lake Tahoe. I drove around the entire lake, from the California side to the Nevada side, stopping to take in some views and hikes whenever I wanted to. That night I slept in Tahoe City and drove the next morning into Reno. One of the things about being a full-time traveler is you're really dependent on the weather. I noticed a cold front was pushing through the area in just 2 days and it was bringing a lot of snow. So I turned around and headed into Sacramento to get into warmer climates. By then, a friend from Washington State was on a road trip headed south. We met in the small town of Clear Lake, California. After spending the day with Jeremy, I checked the weather and everywhere north was just snow. So I reversed courses again and went south, this time into San Jose, California. Not only did it give me a chance to meet up with a friend who lived in the area, but I decided to take the famous Highway 1 the rest of the way from California into Oregon. And I hugged the California coast all the way into the redwoods. There were lots of gorgeous moments driving along Highway 1, but by far my favorite was the Lost Coast. I took a stroll down the beach outside the town of Fortuna. There's clearly a reason why they call it the Lost Coast. I was all by myself walking down that beach. But like they say, not all those who wander are lost. I spent several days hiking around the redwoods area. While visiting an area called Rays Point along Highway 1, some locals told me I should visit Mount Shasta, a 14,000-foot mountain in Northern California. And being somebody who likes recommendations, I went ahead and I checked it out. Highway 1 might have been a beautiful drive, but it was not beautiful sleeping arrangements. It was just me sleeping on the side of the road every night. That's why when I got to Mount Shasta, I was really excited to get back into some dispersed camping. So I found a place called Castle Lake and I set up camp for a few days. By now I had my eyes set on Crater Lake National Park, which was just north of me in southern Oregon. I got in the car to venture north, but not before stopping in the infamous Weed, California.
Alright, man. I'm in Weed, man. Oh, man, I'm hungry.
Once I got to Crater Lake, they still had about 12 feet of snow on the ground. So the scenic drive is closed, but I don't think I could have asked for a more beautiful moment. The air was crisp and silent, and the sapphire blue that filled that lake was truly only something to see in person. I spent the afternoon walking around where I could without having any skis on and slowly made my way to Bend, Oregon. While in Bend, I did the one thing that everyone wants to do. I visited the last blockbuster on the planet. While around Bend, I did some beautiful hikes, saw some gorgeous waterfalls, went to Sisters, Oregon, and even stayed a night in my tent at Smith Rock State Park. But as my weather trend continued, more snow was pushing into the area, and this time, it was going to stay a while. So I made a bold move to turn around 10 hours and go back to the desert. This time to the middle of Nevada and cross Great Basin National Park off my list.
This car used to only have 100,000.
I did some fun day hikes and did an outstanding tour of Lehman Caves. Great Basin National Park might not have been my favorite park, but the place I was sleeping near there was. vast openness of the desert laid out before me every day, and hardly any traffic drove along that road I was on. I had the entire spot to myself, and I cherished every moment of it. The area was quiet and peaceful, and I didn't want to leave. But all good things must come to an end, and I wanted to see a natural wonder just north of me, the Bonneville Salt Flats.
From when I was 16.
I first heard about the Bonneville Salt Flats some time ago as being a place where they hold land speed records. I enjoyed my time out there, but quickly realized the price you pay for driving on the flats. Salt was literally caked to my car, every inch of it. I guess I expected to get some on my car, but nothing like this. It took me about 4 hours the next day to wash all that off.
Breathe, wait a little longer, we begin.
But que sera, sera. So I pushed on to Salt Lake City so I can get new tires for my car and go to Antelope Island.
All I want is you.
Antelope Island ended up being a bit of a false advertisement because I didn't see any antelope, but I saw lots and lots of wild bison. I really enjoyed my time up there and the warm weather, but it was time to get to a state I've never been to before and always wanted to visit, Idaho. I went to where Evel Knievel tried to rocket himself over a 1-mile stretch of the Snake River, and I watched several base jumpers jump off a bridge in downtown. But once again, the weather pushed me away, and I was only able to stay in town for 24 hours. But that's okay, because by now the weather had gotten much better in Oregon, and my plan was to always come back and hit the Pacific Northwest coast. And I knew that I'd get back to Idaho whenever I started my East Coast journey. Since I was coming in from the east, I stopped in the middle of the state for a couple of picturesque waterfalls before hitting the coast. Once I got to the coast, I started heading north until I got into Washington. Even on rainy days, the PNW just doesn't disappoint. I made my way up to Cannon Beach, most famous for Haystack Rock, which has been a rising star ever since the Goonies. And I pushed through Portland so I could see Multnomah Falls and a few other waterfalls in the area. From Portland, I drove north into Washington State. My first stop, one of my favorite parks, Mount Rainier. I found a quiet, secluded spot just down the road from the park and stayed a few days. From the south entrance of Rainier, I drove north and did a day hike into what I could only describe as simply one of the most gorgeous places on earth, the Enchantments. Surrounded by pristine, snow-capped mountains and stunning forests, the Enchantments were like any place I've ever seen before. The placidity and serenity of this protected land can only be accessed by foot and only with a registered pass. A light snowdrift awaited me as I pushed up the nearly 2,400-foot, almost 10-mile trail. My skill set and gear are not prepared for the nearly 40-mile round-trip hike that goes into the Enchantments, but one day I plan on coming back and completing the entire hike. One of these days. Just down the street from the Enchantments is the small town of Leavenworth. A small town in the middle of Washington that is completely remodeled to look like a Bavarian town. Gorgeous flowers, German flags and architecture, beer gardens, and even a maypole align the downtown area. It was really a fun place, and I enjoyed lunch and a few beers while talking to locals there. To the northeast is the little touristy town of Winthrop, Washington. And just a few miles up a dusty dirt road from Peregrine Lake State Park was a quintessential campsite. Acres and acres of forests, wildflowers, and stunning views of the North Cascades lay out before me every single day. I had endless amounts of firewood, a strong cell signal, and no one around me. For a nomad, this is paradise. I was still talking to Waleska every night, and we wanted to see each other. So she decided to fly into Seattle. I started heading west so I could meet up with her, and that put me on a perfect path to go through the North Cascades. A scenic drive unlike any other. Incredible waterfalls, mountains, and iconic views await me. They say it's the least visited national park in the United States, and I honestly just can't understand why. It was one of those areas you could spend a month in and only scratch the surface. I got to the Seattle area just a few days before Alaska came into town, so I stayed just north of the city in a place called Oak Harbor. I then ventured the 2 hours south of Seattle to spend nearly a week with my girlfriend. Seeing Waleska absolutely put a smile on my face. It was so nice to be around her and spend time together. However, I just can't say the same about being in the city. Once again, the noise, congestion, and constant aggravation of crowds made me realize just how much I really value the tranquility of nature. After Waleska left town, I immediately left the city and spent a week in Olympic National Park. I went to the northwesternmost part of the US and contemplated my next move while at camp. My original plan was to venture north into Alaska once I was done with Washington, but after careful consideration, the long drive, the lack of time, and the high gas prices steered me away. And there was one place that was always on my bucket list anyways: the Canadian Rockies. I'm not a religious person, but I think there's simply only one way to describe the intense beauty of this area of the world: heaven on earth. It's literally one of those places that every 5 minutes you're staring at a place that is even more gorgeous than the last. And every time you get to a new place, you think to yourself, this is even more beautiful than the last place I just saw. But nature just keeps throwing you curveballs, and you can't help but stop, slow down, and just enjoy the moment. I did the parks from north to south. First Jasper National Park, then the iconic Icefields Parkway, next Yoho National Park, and of course, Banff. Banff is legendary for Lake Louise and Moraine Lake. I got up early and hiked over 13 miles and over 3,700 feet elevation around both lakes. By now it had sunk in. This is one place I knew I'd have to come back and spend an entire summer at. As much as I would have loved to stay there till fall, I only had about 4 more months to complete my 1-year journey on the road, and there was still so much to see on the US and East Coast.
Alone in this house.
So I saw one more park, Waterton Lakes, before crossing the border and entering stateside back through Big Sky Country, Montana.
Alone through my blinds. It's cold outside.
I stayed nearly a week at Glacier National Park. Before heading south to a place I never even heard of before entering the area, Highlight Canyon, just outside of Bozeman, Montana, and north of Yellowstone National Park. I threw my paddleboard in the water and spent the nights with no cell phone reception. It was peace and quiet. By this point, I decided to turn around and hit the rest of Idaho that I had missed just 2 months earlier. I set my sights on Stanley, Idaho, which is an area I've always heard is ideal for anybody who loves the outdoors. I camped out near a river, did some amazing hikes, and just relaxed at camp. In Idaho, I met a full-time YouTuber whose channel I had been watching for years in preparation for this journey. Tristan from SUV RVing agreed to come out and get a little tour of my Teardrop for his channel. It was a real gem meeting him, but literally just 10 minutes after he left, the worst thing possible happened to me. Trying to start it, but it's not doing anything. Yeah. So I think my battery's dead. Since I was camped out in a pretty remote area, I had to wait till someone drove by so I could get the car jumped. Fortunately, it didn't take that long, and since my car is still under warranty, I called up the nearest Subaru dealership, which is over 2 hours south of me. So I took the unexpected detour down there to have it checked out. Since the dealership was located in Twin Falls, after the car got fixed, I took a little trip out to Box Canyon for the day. Since I was only in Stanley one day before my car problems, I decided to go back and really enjoy the area for the next couple days. But not before hitting some natural hot springs along the way. From Stanley, I moved east to Craters of the Moon National Monument. And finally, a place that was probably highest on my bucket list items: Yellowstone National Park. My friend Sarah flew in from Florida so we can go to Yellowstone National Park and the Grand Tetons. I've never done much reading about Yellowstone, so aside from Old Faithful, I really didn't know what to expect. But there were endless bison, more than 500 geysers, thermal basins, hot spring pools, spring rivers, and so much more. Yellowstone was just unlike any place I've ever seen before. It's a massive park, and it took us about 2 days to just drive around and see all the major spots. Not far from Yellowstone is Grand Tetons National Park. At first I thought I was going to be more impressed with the Tetons, but since I had just been in the Sawtooth Mountains over in Idaho, and Yellowstone ended up being this completely different experience unlike any other, the Tetons just didn't rank as high for me as I expected. The one thing that did make the Tetons a little bit different experience for me, however, was the fact that I had to walk about 7 feet away from a black bear while on one of the trails. But after seeing several other people walk past him and seeing that the bear didn't care much, and the fact that multiple other hikers were on the trail, I didn't really worry about it too much. It still didn't stop me from keeping my bear spray in my hand and having it ready as I walked past him though. I wanted to videotape me walking by him, but thought it was much more important to just keep my eyes on him and pay attention to any sudden moves he might make. So that little moment is just for me. Sorry I wasn't able to share. My friend flew back home to Florida, and that meant I was back on the road. Driving east across Wyoming, I dropped one pin on my map: Devil's Tower, home of aliens and being America's first national monument. Ever since I saw Close Encounters of the Third Kind as a kid, I've been intrigued by this unique mountain. And wouldn't you know it, they play the movie every night there at the entrance, free to whomever wants to watch it.
In this dark night,
Devil's Tower is just about 2 hours from Mount Rushmore, one of my biggest bucket list destinations. I hiked around the trails leading up to the rocky terrain of the Black Hills and took in the sights of the grand sculpture from every angle. South Dakota is also home to Wind Caves National Park and Jewel Caves National Monument. I did tours at both and took in the complete beauty of Custer State Park. While sleeping just outside the park, I drove out to a lone stretch of the road at night and stared up at the Milky Way above. Next up was Badlands National Park. Another area I did little research on, and that meant it was another area that ended up being one of my favorite spots. I camped out on some gorgeous BLM land located just outside the boundaries of the park and took in some amazing sights. People often ask me, what was your favorite place on the road? And I honestly have to say that any place I was able to sleep safely at night was my favorite. If the area had a strong cell service, and even better, a complete lack of any kind of noise, then I was quick to call it my favorite place. Badlands had all of that, and some of the best night sky I've ever seen before. I even did an astronomy tour at the visitor center that the park system puts on for free every night. I got to see the rings of Saturn and even Jupiter through a telescope. It was by far one of my favorite moments on the road, and I was feeling pretty lucky to be a part of it. What I wasn't having a lot of luck with, however, was the fact that I was having a hard time making a strong connection with Waleska while I was out on the open road. I've never had a long-distance relationship before, and I can see why now. While we continued to talk every day, my love language is spending quality time with somebody. And since she was still in Newport Beach and I was literally in a different state every single week, I had a hard time allowing myself to be mentally connected to someone so far away. And finally, one day, as I was literally at a place stamped the geographical center of the nation in Belfort, South Dakota, we spoke on the phone and broke up. I still talk to Waleska, and she remains an important person in my life. I'm sure that one of these days we'll see each other again, but until then, I think my love life is going to have a hard time finding that deeper connection with somebody while I continue to live the nomad lifestyle. A fun fact about the Great Plains, there are over 1,000 missiles buried below its surface. An arsenal of nuclear warheads known as Minuteman missiles were hidden in plain sight for 30 years during the Cold War. So given the opportunity, I drove out to one of the deactivated sites and peered at the top of what was once a literal civilization destroyer. After viewing man's greatest and worst invention ever, I toured north into another state's borders that were new to me, North Dakota. I went to Teddy Roosevelt National Park, camped out at a gorgeous lake, and then took the long drive east, across the prairies to Minnesota. North Dakota might not have been my favorite state, but any day I get to just drive, I don't mind. I absolutely love seeing the terrain change in front of me and just truly get lost in the absolute beauty of this nation. I stopped at Voyageurs National Park, hugged the western shorelines of Lake Superior, past Gooseberry Falls State Park, and slowly made my way to Pictured Rocks National Seashore, which is in the upper Michigan Peninsula. A friend who I used to work with lives in Madison, Wisconsin, and since I was just 5 hours north of him, I headed south so we could catch up. While staying with Nick and his wife, he offered to take me up in a private plane, since he's had his pilot's license for a few years now. We flew all over the countryside of Wisconsin. After a few days there, I continued my drive east to see Indiana Dunes National Park, Cuyahoga Valley National Park in Ohio, the shores of Lake Erie, and eventually, Niagara Falls. Alright, I gotta admit, I wasn't exactly sure Niagara Falls was gonna wow me. I mean, I've seen lots of waterfalls up to this point on my journey, so really, what was going to be so special about this one? The sheer length and size of Niagara was impressive, that nature can deliver such a huge impact in such a small space of the world. I spent half the afternoon walking around the New York side, and even getting as close as you can to the falls through a place called Wind Caves. But of course you're right there, so why not cross international borders and see it from a different view? I spent the next 48 hours in Ontario, Canada, viewing the splendor of the falls at night and during the day. Taking in a boat ride and wandering like a tourist. By now, I was set to see New England in the fall, a time of year and area of the country I deliberately planned together. I jetted east across New York State, stopping at Green Lake State Park, and then through the Adirondacks. I even stopped by Lake Placid to see where the Miracle on Ice happened in 1980. As the colors on the leaves started to change in front of me, I knew I was going to see something special once I hit the rest of the Northeast.
Sorry if I haven't been here. I hope you feel alright. Sorry that I didn't show up.
I spent about a week in Vermont, a state I know I want to go back to in the future and spend much more time at. But I definitely made sure I saw the Ben & Jerry's plant, even though they were closed while I was there. They even have a flavor graveyard for those ice cream flavors that didn't exactly live up to their hype. I stopped in Stowe, Vermont, and walked around the misty night under a full moon. I hiked up Table Rock and did one of my windiest hikes ever at Monroe State Park. Continuing my east descent, I drove into New Hampshire and enjoyed the areas at Franconia Notch State Park. Once I hit Maine, I slowed down a little bit, stopping for a while in one of my favorite towns ever, Rangeley, Maine. As I mentioned before, my favorite places on the road were any place I could sleep at comfortably and not worry about being harassed. Rangeley isn't a town you've probably ever heard of unless you live in the area. But Rangeley not only offered me some of the best night's sleep I've ever had on the road, they also had gorgeous waterfalls and hikes in the area. Even though I lost my wallet for 24 hours there before finding it the next day, it's still one of my favorite locations I've ever visited. Small towns like this are exactly what keep me on the road. By now, if you couldn't tell, I like parks. And there was a big one just southeast of me, Acadia National Park. Approaching the park, I did very little research about what to expect, so naturally, I was impressed with everything I saw. By now, the leaves weren't changing as much for me anymore, but that's okay. I thoroughly enjoyed my time in the area, hiking as much as I could, and taking in the many, many views. I even got to meet a subscriber who was traveling around the country in a teardrop of his own. I left Acadia to see a friend who lived just 3 hours to the west. By now, I was starting to make my slow descent back to Florida, stopping by a few areas along the way. Since it was so close to Halloween, I set out to see the infamous Salem, Massachusetts, home of the absolutely insane Salem witch trials that happened in 1692. Spending Halloween around here just felt right. Since I was on a history kick, I made sure I stopped at the location of Plymouth Rock, and then a scenic drive into Cape Cod. I had a really great jack-o'-lantern exhibit in Rhode Island, spent just 2 nights in Connecticut, 2 more nights in Sleepy Hollow, New York, and then to see an icon every American is familiar with, the Statue of Liberty. I found a tour that left out of New Jersey and stops at the statue and Ellis Island. At first I didn't think I was going to be that interested in Ellis Island, but the countless stories and endless rooms intrigued me much more than I expected. Of course, getting up this close to Lady Liberty felt intensely appropriate for this adventure, since it had now been exactly 1 year to the date that I left Tampa to see the entire US. It made me realize just how lucky I really was to have experienced this incredible journey. I pushed through more historical spots in Philadelphia by stopping by Independence Hall, which is the birthplace of the US Constitution, getting up close to the Liberty Bell, and running up a set of steps only a man named Rocky could have made famous. After just a few days in Delaware and Maryland, I made my way to Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. Shenandoah ended up being a much bigger park than I expected. One of the rangers told me it would take about 3 hours to drive from the north end to the south end without stopping. By the time I got there, all the leaves had fallen, so there wasn't any good fall colors to see on the trees. I'm sure this is one area that truly stands out in autumn. I did one of their most famous hikes, and after a few days, I drove to my 40th national park, New River Gorge in West Virginia. By now, the thoughts of getting home to Florida and seeing family and friends were crossing my mind every hour of every day. The fact that I only had 1 more week on the road was giving me mixed thoughts about what I had just accomplished and what lay ahead. The fact that I only had 1 week left until I completed my circle around the entire country. 1 week until I would be back home. I checked New River Gorge off my list and darted around some cold weather just before arriving to Congaree National Park in South Carolina. After a brief afternoon in the park, I drove out to the beach to catch my last sunset on the road. It was official. By this time tomorrow, I would be back in Florida. I would be back at my starting place. I would be done with traveling. And on November 17th, 2022, I pulled into my brother's driveway in Jacksonville, Florida, and unhitched my teardrop one final time. I had just completed a whole year of traveling on the road in a teardrop trailer. A dream I've wanted to achieve for more than 20 years. Saying it feels surreal is an understatement. It's like it almost never happened. It was just something I did. It broke me at times, literally, and I had severe doubts at times of why I was even doing this. Oh my God, what have I done? I'm living in my car. I quit my job. I have no income. I have no health care. I don't know where I'm going, and I slept in a parking lot last night. My longest drought in between showers was 8 days, and I slept in more parking lots and turnouts on the side of the road than I even want to admit. So yeah, sleeping in a parking lot tonight. This is the reality when you travel full time. You're not always in some amazing camp spot for the night. But I connected with humans and nature all over this country in a way I don't think I would have ever been able to achieve if I was just on vacation. Editing this video reminded me of details that I just can't describe and moments that I never captured on film. I saw parts of the United States that I never even heard about before, and places that I never wanted to leave. I escaped a normal life, only to find my normal life on the road. Hey, check out my new Amazon storefront. These are the items I used every day on the road as I traveled across the country for an entire year. I have it grouped by teardrop items, camping gear, car items, hiking gear, and apparel. By making purchases in the link in the description, you're helping me and the channel make more videos for you.